And my mum and dad weren't in a great place, and I hadn't really spent a lot of time with them in the previous decade because I'd been out trying to establish who I was, and I didn't really go home very much. And so what I did is I decided instead of buying an apartment in the city, I'd buy 100 acres in the bush, and my mum and dad could go and live there, and basically they could start fresh and have a sort of a new experience.
Everyone knows Russell Crowe, the gravel-voiced anti-hero who stormed the Colosseum in Gladiator, the tortured genius in A Beautiful Mind, the man whose temper and talent were equally unmissable. He became the face of Hollywood's golden late 90s renaissance, equal parts fury and poetry. His name filled marquees, his roles won Oscars, and his shadow stretched across the screen like an empire. But few realized that while the world obsessed over his performances and his infamous brawls, he was also quietly a father. 2 boys born into the most contradictory of legacies, the children of a man celebrated as both a cinematic titan and a tabloid headline. For the paparazzi, Crowe was an easy target, grizzled, unpredictable, sometimes shirtless on Sydney streets with a cigarette in hand. Yet in the quiet hours, away from the flashbulbs, he was raising Charles and Tennyson, 2 sons who carried a surname heavy with expectation. Imagine being a child whose father is defined by rage and glory. The man cheered in arenas on screen, jeered in tabloids off screen. One moment he's holding an Oscar aloft, the next he's accused of throwing a phone at a hotel employee. And through it all, 2 boys watched, often hidden from the public eye, yet always tethered to his legend. The public knew Russell Crowe's roles. They knew the gladiator's roar, the detective's brooding silence, the mathematician's haunted brilliance. What they didn't see were the family barbecues in Woolloomooloo, the soccer practices with his sons in Sydney, or the way he tried, sometimes clumsily, sometimes fiercely, to shield them from the circus of fame. Crowe himself once said that fatherhood was his greatest role, the one that mattered beyond red carpets or studio contracts. But fatherhood under a microscope is never simple. The cameras weren't just aimed at him, they trailed his children too. Paparazzi caught them leaving airports, being carried as toddlers, their faces blurred in tabloids but never forgotten. For Charles and Tennyson, the spotlight was both a threat and an inheritance, something they never asked for, but could never escape. So what happens to the children of a gladiator? Do they inherit the fire, the rage, the artistry? Or do they retreat into the shadows, determined to be anything but their father? Russell Crowe's name still echoes in theaters, his career still a strange cocktail of brilliance and volatility. But beyond the myth, there are 2 sons whose stories have remained untold. 2 young men born into fame, but not necessarily destined for it. And that brings us to the question at the heart of this story. What really happened to Charles and Tennyson Crowe?
The story of Russell Crowe begins not with Hollywood, but with New Zealand backlots and Australian pub stages. Born in Wellington in 1964, he was the son of caterers who worked on film sets, an ordinary childhood set against the artificial magic of cameras and lights. He grew up watching actors eat the meals his parents served, glimpsing a world of performance before he ever touched a script. By the 1980s, Crowe was fronting a rock band, 30-odd foot of grunts, all rough edges and cigarette smoke. Music gave him swagger, but film gave him destiny. Australian cinema, in its raw, rebellious renaissance, handed him breakout roles in Romper Stomper and Proof. He wasn't polished, he wasn't charming, he was dangerous, magnetic, and uncontainable, the kind of actor who seemed to carry a storm inside him. Hollywood noticed. By the late 1990s, Crowe was in the heart of it all. LA Confidential established him, The Insider elevated him, and Gladiator crowned him. The Roman general Maximus wasn't just a role, it became a cultural phenomenon. Crowe's growl of vengeance and dignity reverberated around the world, winning him the Academy Award and cementing him as one of the last true cinematic gladiators, flesh, fury, and fatalism. But with fame came infamy. Crowe was never a studio darling in the way others were. He fought with producers, journalists, and sometimes random strangers. The press dubbed him Hollywood's bad boy, a headline magnet who could follow up a breathtaking performance with an equally breathtaking scandal. There was the infamous hotel phone incident in 2005, bar brawls in Sydney, heated interviews, and a reputation for volcanic moods. For audiences, it was theater. For his sons, it was life. Behind the roars and red carpets was a quieter reality. Crowe married Danielle Spencer in 2003, the same year their first son Charles was born. By then, he was already at the peak of his career, but fatherhood rearranged the set. In interviews, he spoke about changing diapers while reading scripts, about how the boys grounded him. When their second son, Tennyson, was born in 2006, he named him after Alfred Lord Tennyson, the poet, a deliberate choice to remind the world that beneath his fists and fury lived a man who cared about words. Yet Crowe's marriage faltered. By 2012, he and Spencer separated, the tabloids circling like vultures. Divorce under a spotlight is painful enough. For Charles and Tennyson, it was front-page news. The custody arrangements, the shifting homes between Sydney and Crowe's rural New South Wales estate, all played out with cameras lingering nearby. They were teenagers growing up in a world where their father's triumphs and failures were broadcast daily. Imagine being 15, logging online and seeing strangers dissect your father's latest outburst. Imagine walking to school while knowing your surname carried whispers. That was the reality for Charles and Tennyson. Their father was Maximus to the world, but at home he was Dad, sometimes tired, sometimes playful, sometimes distracted by battles the public never stopped demanding of him. Crowe did try to keep them close. He was photographed at rugby games with them, teaching them guitar, keeping them away from Los Angeles's glitter, and keeping them in Sydney instead. His great project was not just to shape his own legacy, but to make sure his sons had the chance at an ordinary one. Whether he succeeded is the question that lingers. Because beyond the legend, behind the shouting headlines and Oscar speeches, lived two children, and those children, now young men, had to find out who they were in the shadow of their father's myth. Number 2. Tennyson Crowe, born July 7, 2006, in Sydney, Australia. His name was not chosen casually. Russell and Danielle named him after Alfred Lord Tennyson, the great Victorian poet of longing and memory, as if they hoped words might shape destiny. Yet from the beginning, destiny looked less like verse and more like escape. Tennyson entered the world when his father was at the height of both triumph and turmoil. The family lived in a mansion in Woolloomooloo, with paparazzi stationed almost permanently outside. Pictures of Russell carrying his newborn son made headlines across Australian tabloids. His face was blurred, his name withheld, yet the boy was already public property. Childhood for Tennyson was quieter than outsiders might imagine, though always staged under the watchful eye of cameras. He attended private schools in Sydney, shielded as best as possible by his parents' insistence on normalcy. Russell, for all his volcanic reputation, often spoke of cooking family dinners and reading to his boys. But the separation from Danielle in 2012 fractured the illusion of domestic stability. Tennyson, only 6, found his childhood rearranged by lawyers' filings and paparazzi flashbulbs. Unlike his older brother Charles, who bore the brunt of public attention as the firstborn son of Maximus, Tennyson drifted into adolescence with less intrusion. Friends describe him as thoughtful, private, almost allergic to the idea of publicity. He played sports quietly, experimented with music, and tried to stitch together an identity outside of Hollywood's orbit. It wasn't rebellion in the loud sense. No wild headlines, no scandals. His defiance was subtler, a refusal to perform. But the real shock came years later. In 2022, when Russell was cast in Thor: Love and Thunder, gossip blogs resurfaced photos of Tennyson, now a teenager, walking beside his father on red carpets.
Fans gasped at how tall he'd grown, how much he looked like his mother. For Tennyson, those brief flashes of recognition were unwelcome reminders that anonymity was fragile. You can grow taller, change schools, adopt new friends, but your last name is unshakable. Adulthood is still forming for him. At 19, Tennyson has largely avoided the paths expected of celebrity children. No acting auditions, no public accounts flaunting wealth. Instead, he keeps his head low, his name quiet. Those who know him suggest he's drawn more to literature and music than to cameras. A young man with more interest in verses than vengeance. And yet, the weight of inheritance lingers. Imagine discovering at 14 that your father was once the most famous man on earth, a gladiator etched into cinema's bloodstream. Imagine teachers, classmates, even strangers whispering about you before you've had a chance to decide who you are. For Tennyson, that whisper is constant, but he seems determined to keep walking straight through it.
Number 1. Charles Spencer Crowe, born December 21, 2003, in Sydney. The firstborn son of Russell Crowe and Danielle Spencer, he entered the world with the weight of expectation already resting on his shoulders. Paparazzi stalked his first outings, tabloids speculated about his christening, and strangers debated whether he'd grow into his father's jawline or his mother's artistry. From the start, Charles wasn't just a baby, he was an heir. His early childhood unfolded in tandem with Russell's peak stardom. While his father accepted an Academy Award, Charles was barely walking. While Russell trained for physically punishing roles, Charles was learning to ride a bike. And yet, the two realities collided in ways he couldn't avoid. The phone-throwing incident of 2005, when Charles was just 2, ensured his father's temper was immortalized in headlines. Those headlines were read by classmates' parents, teachers, and neighbors. To be Charles Crowe was to inherit not only the glamour, but also the chaos. Unlike his younger brother, Charles was often seen in public. Photos of him at rugby matches with Russell surfaced throughout the years, showing a boy growing taller, stronger, and more visible. By his teenage years, he bore a striking resemblance to his father. Same sharp eyes, same serious expression. The comparison was flattering to outsiders, but to Charles it may have been a burden. Imagine being a teenager whose every feature invites the question, will you be like him? His parents' separation in 2012 marked a pivotal shift. At 9 years old, Charles had to navigate 2 households, the silent tensions of custody and the endless tabloid speculation. Russell, despite his rugged public persona, often insisted that his children were his anchor. He was photographed taking Charles to school, flying him to sporting events, and speaking openly about the importance of being present. But presence under the spotlight is never simple. For Charles, each public outing was another photograph, another reminder that privacy was impossible. High school years brought whispers of athletic promise. Charles was said to have excelled in rugby and soccer, with Russell cheering from the sidelines. But rather than pushing him toward the screen, his parents seemed intent on giving him freedom. Unlike many celebrity offspring, Charles did not surface in casting announcements or red carpet cameos. His adolescence was guarded, almost militantly so, as if he and his brother had been instructed to resist the gravitational pull of Hollywood. But the real twist came as he reached adulthood. In 2022, at 18, Charles accompanied his father to the premiere of Poker Face. Photographers caught him in a suit, standing shoulder to shoulder with Russell. For many fans, it was the first time they had truly seen him grown. The tabloids ran side-by-side comparisons, noting how he looked like a young Russell Crowe. Social media buzzed with speculation. Was he entering the industry? Was this his debut? But days passed, weeks, and nothing followed. Charles retreated again, into silence. Now 21, Charles remains a figure of curiosity. No confirmed acting credits, no public career path, no official social media. Some reports suggest he continues to study in Australia, living quietly, choosing anonymity over spotlight. In an era when the children of stars often monetize their lineage instantly, Charles has done the opposite. His greatest rebellion may be the decision not to become his father's sequel. And yet the haunting detail remains. For all his efforts of invisibility, he cannot erase the name. Charles Crowe, son of Russell. It follows him in every search result, every introduction, every glance that lingers too long. He is a young man defined, at least in public, by the question of what he will do with an inheritance he never asked for. What really happened to Charles? Perhaps nothing. And in a world obsessed with spectacle, perhaps nothing is the bravest choice of all.
Russell Crowe has lived as both legend and cautionary tale. To audiences, he was Maximus, an immortal figure of vengeance, power, and dignity. To tabloids, he was the man with the short fuse, the unpredictable star whose temper made almost as many headlines as his acting. But to Charles and Tennyson, he was simply Dad. Flawed, famous, deeply human, trying to raise two sons while the world insisted on watching. Few people realize how profoundly children inherit the shadow of fame. They are born into lives they did not choose, their faces blurred in tabloids, yet still consumed by strangers, their family arguments whispered about in headlines. Charles and Tennyson grew up in that paradox, where anonymity was both a right and a battle. Their father roared on screen, but they chose silence. Everything changed when they became old enough to be seen standing beside him in public. The resemblance was undeniable, the comparisons instant. Fans and journalists alike leaned in with expectation. Would they act, sing, become public figures? But instead of capitalizing on the attention, both sons quietly withdrew again. In a culture addicted to spectacle, their refusal to perform may be their most powerful statement. Imagine being offered the world's attention not for what you've done, but for who your father is, and deciding to walk away. Imagine deliberately choosing obscurity when fame is your inheritance. That is the choice both Charles and Tennyson seem to have made, at least so far. Their story is not one of scandal or tragedy, not the downfall of lost children and the Hollywood machine. It is a quieter, subtler rebellion. The story of two young men who resisted the gravitational pull of celebrity and insisted on building identities in silence. For once, the absence of drama may be the most haunting detail of all. And that leaves us with the chilling truth. Behind every legendary name are lives the world was never meant to see. Children raised in the ruins and the glory of myth, carving out identities in defiance of the spotlight. Charles and Tennyson Crowe are not actors, not heirs to a cinematic throne, not tabloid curiosities, at least not willingly. They are the sons of a gladiator, choosing their own paths beyond the arena. If you carried that last name, would you keep it or bury it forever?